We've all been told Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise. But what if it wasn't? These are the 7 suspicious details that suggest the US knew the attack was coming. Welcome to the Purple Files. If you enjoy our videos, please consider subscribing to the channel. Let's get right into it. December 7th, 1941. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy. And for over 80 years, that is exactly how history has remembered it. The official story is etched into the mind of every American. On a peaceful Sunday morning, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a devastating surprise attack against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, the assault killed 2,403 Americans, wounded over 1,000 more, and crippled the heart of the Pacific Fleet. The attack was presented as an unprovoked and dastardly act that shocked a nation and, in a single moment, shattered America's steadfast isolationism, plunging it headfirst into the Second World War. The narrative is powerful because on the surface it is entirely true. The attack was brutal, the losses were catastrophic, and it did unify the country with a resolve that would change the course of world history. The image of the sinking US Arizona became a rallying cry for an entire generation. The story of a sleeping giant awakened by a treacherous enemy is the story we have all been told, the one taught in our history books and immortalized in film. It is the story of tragic failure, but also of heroic resilience and ultimate victory. It is simple, clean, and compelling. But for as long as the official story has existed, so too have unsettling questions and deeply suspicious details that suggest a far more complex and disturbing reality. For decades, historians, military insiders, and researchers have pointed to a trail of evidence that complicates the narrative of a complete surprise. They highlight declassified documents, ignored warnings, and a series of seemingly inexplicable coincidences that all occurred in the days, weeks, and even months leading up to the attack. These details suggest that, at the very least, key figures in the American government had ample reason to believe an attack was imminent, and at worst, that they may have allowed it to happen to provide the spark needed to enter the war. This video will not claim to have the final answer to one of history's most debated events. Instead, we will step back from the accepted narrative and examine the evidence that has fueled these suspicions for nearly a century. We will investigate the 7 most compelling and well-documented details that challenge the official story of Pearl Harbor, from decoded messages that were allegedly ignored to critical military assets that were conveniently moved out of harm's way just hours before the bombs fell. These are the facts that keep the controversy alive. By the end, you can decide for yourself. Was it the greatest intelligence failure in American history, or was it something else entirely? Our first exhibit is not a battlefield artifact, but a chillingly prophetic document born from the quiet halls of naval intelligence. In October of 1940, more than a full year before the attack, a lieutenant commander named Arthur McCollum wrote a memorandum that has since become a cornerstone for researchers questioning the official narrative. McCollum was the head of the Far East Asia section of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and his job was to understand and predict the actions of Japan. The memo he authored, now declassified and known as the McCollum Memo, proposed a stunningly direct 8-step course of action for the United States to follow in its dealings with the Japanese Empire. The stated goal of this plan was unambiguous: to provoke Japan into committing an overt act of war against the United States. The 8 actions laid out in the memo were not vague suggestions. They were specific diplomatic and military provocations designed to back Japan into a corner. The plan called for making arrangements with the British to use their naval bases in the Pacific, particularly the key port of Singapore. It called for doing the same with the Dutch for access to their facilities in the Dutch East Indies. It advocated for giving all possible aid to the Chinese government, which was actively at war with Japan. It proposed sending divisions of heavy cruisers and submarines to the Orient, keeping the main fleet in Hawaii as a direct threat, pressuring the Dutch to deny Japan oil, and finally instituting a complete and total trade embargo, cutting off Japan from vital resources. The existence of such a memo is, on its own, not definitive proof of a conspiracy. Governments and their militaries create contingency plans for all manner of scenarios. However, what makes the McCollum Memo so deeply suspicious is what happened over the course of the next year. By early December of 1941, President Roosevelt's administration had implemented every single one of the 8 provocative actions outlined in the memo, from the oil embargo that threatened to cripple the Japanese war machine to the strategic placement of the fleet at Pearl Harbor. The American posture towards Japan followed McCollum's playbook to the letter. This sequence of events presents a difficult question. Was the eventual attack by Japan truly a surprise, or was it the perfectly predictable and perhaps even desired outcome of a deliberate year-long policy of provocation? Proponents of the official story argue that these were simply logical, defensive steps taken in response to Japanese aggression in Asia, and that there is no hard evidence Roosevelt ever acted directly on this specific memo. But for critics, the alignment is too perfect to be a coincidence. It suggests that far from being an unsuspecting victim, the United States knowingly and methodically lit a fuse and then acted surprised when the powder keg finally exploded. In the naval strategy of the 1940s, a new queen had emerged on the chessboard of oceanic warfare: the aircraft carrier. While the massive, powerful battleships were still symbols of national prestige, it was the carriers, with their ability to project air power across hundreds of miles, that had become the true measure of a navy's strength. They were the most valuable, most strategic, and most important assets in the entire United States Pacific Fleet. And on the morning of December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes swarmed the skies over Pearl Harbor, not a single one of them was present. The 3 aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet were the USA Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USA Saratoga. Their absence during the attack is perhaps the most famous and glaring coincidence in the entire Pearl Harbor story. The Saratoga was in San Diego, having just completed repairs. The other 2, however, were on missions that had sent them away from the base just days before the attack. The Enterprise was on its way back from delivering a squadron of Marine Corps fighter planes to Wake Island, 2,000 miles to the west. The Lexington was on a similar mission, having been sent to ferry bombers to Midway Island. The Japanese attack therefore spent its force on a row of aging, obsolete battleships, while the heart of American naval power remained untouched, steaming safely in the open ocean. This fact has always been the central pillar of the foreknowledge theory. The primary targets for the Japanese Navy were, without question, the American carriers. Sinking them would have effectively ended the United States' ability to wage war in the Pacific for at least a year, perhaps longer. Their survival meant that while the nation suffered a devastating and humiliating blow, its capacity for retaliation was fully preserved. Critics argue that sending the carriers away on what amounted to routine delivery missions at a time when intelligence indicated tensions were at their absolute breaking point seems like an impossibly convenient stroke of good luck. It was a decision that saved the American war effort in the Pacific before it even began. The official explanation is that these missions were prudent and necessary efforts to reinforce outlying American islands, and that the timing was purely coincidental. There was no specific intelligence, they argue, that could have pinpointed the exact date or location of the Japanese attack, and protecting the fleet's carriers was always a top priority. But to skeptics, this explanation feels thin. They ask if it is truly believable that the most valuable ships in the fleet were sent away on secondary missions, leaving the battleships clustered together like sitting ducks, purely by chance. Was it a miracle of good fortune? Or was it a calculated decision to sacrifice the pawns to protect the Queen? Long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, the United States possessed one of the most powerful secret weapons of the entire war: the ability to read Japan's most secret diplomatic code. Through a brilliant intelligence effort, codenamed Magic, American cryptographers had broken the complex cipher used by the Japanese Foreign Ministry. This gave the highest levels of the American government an open window into the communications between Tokyo and its embassies and consulates all over the world. They were, in effect, reading Japan's mail. And in the fall of 1941, that mail contained a message that should have set off every alarm bell in Washington. On September 24, 1941, American intelligence intercepted a communication from Japanese naval intelligence to Tokyo's consul in Honolulu, a man named Nagao Kita. The message gave the consul a highly specific and unusual task: to divide the waters of Pearl Harbor into 5 distinct sectors and to begin reporting on the exact locations of American warships moored within that grid. The message asked for the precise berthing positions of all battleships, cruisers, and, most notably, aircraft carriers. This was not a general request for information on fleet strength. This was, for all intents and purposes, a request for a bombing map. The significance of this bomb plot message, as it came to be known, cannot be overstated. It was a massive, flashing red light. The Japanese were not asking for this level of detail about any other American naval base, not San Diego, not Panama. The intense focus on the exact coordinates of ships at anchor in Pearl Harbor pointed to only one logical conclusion. They were planning a surprise naval air attack on the fleet while it was in port. This single piece of intelligence, available to American leaders a full 10 weeks before the attack, directly implicated Pearl Harbor as a primary target. Yet, tragically and inexplicably, this critical warning was never passed with any sense of urgency to the 2 men who needed it most: the commanders in Hawaii, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short. While the decrypted message was circulated among top officials in Washington, the commanders on the ground were left in the dark. The official excuse has always been twofold: that analysts were drowning in a sea of intelligence noise and may not have grasped its full significance, and that they were terrified of compromising the magic source. But for critics, these excuses ring hollow. They argue that leaving the commanders at Pearl Harbor blind to a direct threat against their base goes beyond mere incompetence and crosses into the realm of intentional negligence. While American intelligence was gathering its own clues, other friendly nations in the Pacific were also on high alert. One of the most tantalizing and controversial stories of a lost warning comes not from an American source, but from the Royal Netherlands Navy. According to detailed accounts compiled by authors and historians, a Dutch submarine, the K-16, was on patrol in the waters of Southeast Asia in early December. The Dutch, with their colonial interests in the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, were paying extremely close attention to the movements of the Japanese Navy, as they knew they would be a primary target in any Pacific conflict. What this submarine allegedly found was the holy grail of Allied intelligence: the Japanese First Air Fleet, the very strike force destined for Pearl Harbor, steaming east under radio silence. The story, as it has been pieced together from Dutch naval sources and post-war testimony, is astonishing. The commander of the submarine, Lieutenant Commander L.G. Vandenhergen, is said to have spotted the massive fleet, including multiple aircraft carriers, on a heading that made little sense for an attack on the Philippines or Southeast Asia. Realizing the immense significance of his discovery, he took the extraordinary risk of breaking radio silence to send a coded message to the Dutch Naval Command. The message reportedly detailed the composition, course, and speed of the Japanese fleet. This vital intelligence was then allegedly passed from the Dutch to their British allies in Singapore, who in turn relayed it to their American naval liaison. If true, this means that a direct, eyewitness report of the Japanese attack force on its way to Hawaii was in Allied hands several days before the attack. The warning was not a vague analysis or a diplomatic inference. It was a hard intelligence sighting from a trusted military ally. It specified the most dangerous ships in the Japanese Navy, their carriers, and indicated they were heading into the Central Pacific, far from where most analysts expected them to be. It was, in short, the single piece of information that could have unraveled the entire Japanese plan and allowed Pearl Harbor to prepare for the onslaught. Yet, this critical warning simply vanished. It never reached the commanders in Hawaii. The official American position is that no such report was ever received through official channels in Washington. Skeptics find this denial difficult to believe. They argue that the information was either lost in a sea of bureaucratic incompetence, dismissed as unreliable by analysts who were convinced the attack would come in the Philippines, or, most disturbingly, was deliberately buried by officials in Washington who already knew what was coming and did not want any other nation's intelligence to interfere. Whether it was lost or suppressed, the story of the Dutch warning remains a profound and suspicious what if in the Pearl Harbor saga. The first shot of the Pearl Harbor attack was not fired by a Japanese pilot. It was fired by an American sailor more than a full hour before the first wave of planes screamed down over Ford Island. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 7th, at approximately 6:45 in the morning, the destroyer United States ship Ward was conducting a routine patrol of the defensive sea area just outside the entrance to the harbor. Its crew spotted the conning tower of a small, unfamiliar submarine attempting to trail a cargo ship through the anti-submarine nets and into the naval base. This was one of 5 Japanese midget submarines tasked with infiltrating the harbor to attack the American fleet from below the waves. The captain of the Ward, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, did not hesitate. He was on his first command patrol and acted decisively. He ordered his crew to open fire. The Ward's 4-inch deck gun fired, and the second shot struck the submarine at the waterline. As the small vessel began to sink, the Ward swept over its position and dropped a pattern of depth charges, blasting the intruder on the ocean floor. At 6:53 a.m., Outerbridge sent a coded, urgent message to the 14th Naval District headquarters. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." This was not a guess. It was not a rumor. It was a clear, unambiguous report of direct enemy contact and combat at the very mouth of the naval base. This report should have triggered an immediate base-wide general quarters alarm. The presence of a single enemy submarine implied the presence of a larger mother fleet nearby. It was a definitive sign that an attack was not just possible, but was actively underway. The message was received and quickly decoded. But what followed was a catastrophic series of delays and second-guessing. The duty officer who received the message needed to find his commander to verify it. The commander in turn decided to wait for confirmation before passing the alert up the chain of command to Admiral Kimmel. Precious minutes turned into a full hour. The failure to act on the Ward's report is, for many, one of the most inexcusable blunders of the day. There was no ambiguity in the message. The first shot of the battle had been fired, and the warning it provided was completely and utterly squandered. By the time the naval leadership was seriously considering the implications of the report, the sky was already filled with Japanese planes. The debate over this incident centers on whether the delay was simply a case of peacetime complacency and bureaucratic inertia, or if it was part of a broader pattern of ensuring that no warning would be acted upon until it was far too late. As the chain of command was failing to react to the naval threat from below, a brand new technology was giving a clear warning of the threat from above. On the northern tip of Oahu stood a mobile radar station called Opana Point. The technology was so new that it was not yet fully integrated into the base's defense system, and it was only operated for a few hours each morning. On December 7th, 2 Army privates, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, were scheduled to shut the unit down at 7 a.m. But because the truck to take them to breakfast was late, they left the set on for extra practice. It was a decision that gave them a front row seat to history. At 7:02, a massive and completely unprecedented image appeared on their oscilloscope screen. It was a huge blip, representing a formation of aircraft far larger than anything either man had ever seen. After checking to make sure their equipment was not malfunctioning, they calculated the size and distance of the contact. It was at least 50 aircraft, and likely more, approaching from the north, 132 miles away. Knowing this was highly unusual, Private Lockard followed protocol and called the information center at Fort Shafter to report the sighting. The call was taken by an Army Air Forces lieutenant named Kermit Tyler, who was on his very first day working as a watch officer at the center. When Lockard reported the enormous flight of inbound planes, Tyler's response would become infamous. He considered the report for a moment, but he knew that a flight of 12 American B-17 bombers was scheduled to arrive from California that morning. Assuming the radar had simply picked up that friendly flight, he told Lockhart, "Don't worry about it." He did not ask about the size of the formation, which was many times larger than the expected flight of bombers, nor did he ask about the direction, which was slightly off from where the B-17s were expected. The dismissal of the Opana Point radar warning was the final and best chance to prepare for the air attack. An alert issued at 7:02 would have given Pearl Harbor almost 50 minutes to scramble its fighter planes, man its anti-aircraft batteries, and get its sailors to their battle stations. The loss of life and ships would have been drastically reduced. The official inquiries blamed Lieutenant Tyler's inexperience and the unfortunate coincidence of the incoming B-17 flight, but critics questioned how a sighting of that magnitude, so large the operators initially thought the machine was broken, could be so casually dismissed. It was another critical warning, clear and precise, that was ignored in the final minutes before the disaster. The ultimate smoking gun for many researchers is not found in Hawaii, but in Washington, D.C., within the decrypted magic intelligence itself. On Saturday, December 6th, the day before the attack, American code breakers intercepted and translated the first 13 parts of a 14-part memorandum from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington. The message was a long, formal, and angry declaration, systematically rejecting all American proposals and officially breaking off diplomatic negotiations. After President Roosevelt read the 13 parts that evening, he famously turned to his advisor Harry Hopkins and said, "This means war." The question was no longer if, but when and where. The answer came in the final two intercepts that arrived in Washington on the morning of December 7th. The first was the crucial 14th part of the message, which instructed the Japanese ambassador to present the entire document to the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, at precisely 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The second, even more ominous intercept, ordered the embassy to immediately destroy its code machines. The combination was undeniable proof. The destruction of the code machines meant Japan was severing diplomatic ties completely, and the 1 p.m. deadline was clearly synchronized with a military operation. A quick calculation showed that 1 p.m. in Washington was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. The leadership in Washington now possessed the final pieces of the puzzle, the knowledge that war was coming and a specific time that pointed directly to the opening of hostilities on a Sunday morning. The Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, claimed he was out for a morning horseback ride and could not be reached immediately. When he finally saw the message, he and other top brass conferred and decided to send a warning to the various Pacific commands, including Pearl Harbor. Inexplicably, Marshall dismissed, using the Navy's secure and instantaneous telephone scrambler, fearing it could be intercepted. Instead, he chose to send the most urgent warning of the war via commercial Western Union telegram. This decision sealed Pearl Harbor's fate. The telegram from Washington was held up by normal atmospheric delays. It then arrived at the telegraph office in Honolulu, where it was not marked as urgent. A local messenger boy, Tadao Fuchikami, picked it up and set off on his bicycle to deliver it to Fort Shafter. He was literally driving towards the base when the first Japanese bombs began to fall. The warning message, which could have alerted the base to the exact timing of the attack, arrived hours after the attack was over. For skeptics, the choice to use a slow, unreliable commercial telegram for a message of such monumental importance is the single most damning piece of evidence that the warning was never intended to arrive on time. And that is it. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the Purple Files, click the like button, and drop a comment down below. More videos to come, and until then, thanks for watching.